Hi, everyone. My name is Alexandra Gillies, and I work at the Natural Resource Governance Institute, NRGI. Thanks very much for participating in our MOOC, and I hope that you're enjoying it so far. I have received some questions that you sent in about the political economy and transparency sections. I'm going to assume that you've looked at the lectures and done the readings. I'm just going to dive straight into the questions, which were really interesting to receive. A couple of the questions had to do with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, so the EITI. The first one said, within the EITI initiative, what happens when representatives of civil society have an ideological agenda against the exploitation of natural resources? This has happened. In a number of Latin American countries, there are civil society groups that are mostly interested in stopping oil and mining operations. Sometimes this is true for the whole country. We saw this in Guatemala. In some other cases, it's true just for a region of the country where they don't want to see oil or mining activities in a certain region because of environmental reasons or because the local communities or indigenous peoples don't want that activity to happen there. So for groups that hold these views, how should they engage with the EITI? Some have definitely chosen not to engage. That their view is, the question is not how should these industries be transparent. The question is how should these industries, not be allowed to proceed. And that I think makes sense. I mean, if you look at civil society as kind of an ecosystem, you have certain groups that tend to engage with things like the EITI, that are interested in kind of building bridges and engaging in those kinds of conversations with government and company stakeholders. And you have other groups who are, campaigning and much more critical and, much more kind of strident in their views. And I think that kind of diversity is what makes civil society really strong. I don't think that there's any reason why all civil society groups need to sit down at the EITI table. Now, some have found ways to kind of split the difference. What you see in a few countries is you'll have a civil society coalition that includes groups that are against, mining activities, and the coalition is represented at the EITI. And even though the EITI focuses on transparency, there's no limit on the topics that can be discussed within that forum. And so what you see in a lot of countries is, at the EITI table, when you have civil society sitting down with government and company representatives, topics like this do come up. And there will be discussions around things like, whether mining should be allowed even to begin with or not. There's no reason why the EITI discussion in any country needs to be limited just to transparency issues. So great question, and certainly a struggle that we see in a number of countries. The second EITI question has to do with the kind of reputational gains that companies and governments get from participating. And they say that being part of the EITI gives a seal of goodwill to different companies. What happens if the government, where they're based, pulls out? And the person says, this might be what happens under the new president of the United States, Donald Trump, who has talked about wanting to pull out of different international treaties. And then what happens to the companies in that case? So very specifically, in the EITI, the US could pull out, or any country could pull out in kind of two different ways. One would be to stop the domestic implementation process. So when the US joined the EITI, they started implementing the initiative like any other country, and they've issued a report that discloses, financial data about the sector. And they could stop that effort, which is an effort that looks at the American domestic oil, gas, and mining sector. The other thing they could do would be to pull out at the international level. The US sits on the EITI International Board. It funds the EITI efforts. So it could stop that support at the international level as well. I have no idea whether either of those things are going to happen. Certainly, they do seem, more in danger under the current government than they were under the previous one, absolutely. But there have been no explicit statements about the US intentions to pull out at either of those two levels. But to get to your question, let's say that they did. Let's say the US pulls out in every way, the US government pulls out in every way from the EITI. US companies could still participate in the initiative. And we've seen this in a number of places. So you have companies from France, from Australia, from Italy, from Mexico, who have sat on the EITI board and participated in the process long before their governments chose to sign up to the initiative. So they are kind of not directly linked. You could still have companies participating at the international level on the board, or voluntarily choosing to disclose information about their activities in a way that lines up with the EITI standard. So, I mean, government action doesn't necessarily have to dictate company action when it comes to the EITI. But that's certainly not to say that we want to see governments pulling out necessarily. There's one reason why I think governments like the US and others won't, walk away from the EITI table in some kind of grand gesture. The EITI is a voluntary initiative, and what we see more often is when, and like you say, that it provides a lot of reputational advantages to both governments and companies that sign up. So what you tend to see more often is when there's a drop in political will, a drop in kind of political support for things like transparency, the country tends to kind of ignore implementation, and you see delayed implementation or uneven implementation where they're only implementing the parts of the standard that they agree with. And that's much more common than storming off and kind of cutting ties in some really clear way. And in the EITI right now, there are a number of countries where there's just not a lot of political support for the process, and that shows up in the kinds of implementation there are. So a few thoughts on that, and we'll see what happens from here. The next question was about, please comment on the recent ruling on Dodd-Frank Section 1502 and its potential effects. So this is a great question, very much tied to current events. So I'm going to take a few minutes to kind of provide everybody with an update of what's been happening over the last month or so. So Dodd-Frank is kind of shorthand for the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act, which was a law passed in the US that covered a lot of financial regulation issues. It had two provisions in it that dealt with natural resource governance specifically, and I'll talk about each of them. The first one is Section 1502, and this has to do with conflict minerals, and it basically says that any company that's buying minerals from certain conflict zones, especially in the DRC and Central Africa, has to certify that their minerals didn't come from a certain conflict zone, basically that the production of that minerals didn't feed into that conflict economy. This is a provision that has very good intentions, but as you can imagine, the implementation of it has been very difficult. And what you see is interesting. Activists and experts on the DRC are pretty split on whether this provision is a good idea or not. I'm not an expert on the DRC, so I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other, but you certainly see, even within kind of the activist community, a debate around not whether this is a problem, everyone agrees there's a problem, but whether the kinds of certification mechanisms required by Section 1502 are an effective solution to that problem. So that's what 1502 was. Fast forward to the last month or two, the Trump administration is coming into office in the US. So far, 1502 remains in place. It has not been repealed. What we've seen is some leaked information saying that President Trump may sign an executive order repealing this rule. But so far, it hasn't happened. That's kind of the current status of that. So it's still on the books, but it certainly looks as though there are people within the Trump administration who intend on trying to get this rule repealed. So that's 1502. The other provision is section 1504, and this has to do with payment transparency. This provision is basically what the whole publish what you pay movement kind of was pushing for since its birth. And what it requires is for companies that are based in the US or listed on US stock exchanges have to disclose the payments they make to foreign governments. And they have to break down that information by project. So that means for each mine, you have to kind of break down how much the company paid to a government in royalties and taxes and different fees. So that's what the rule requires. It was first passed in 2010. The government then had to issue more detailed rules and regulations, as typically happens. So the law was passed, but for companies to really know what they had to do, they had to wait for these regulations to be drafted. That took some time. When the regulations were first issued, the oil company lobby in the US, through a group called the American Petroleum Institute, sued the US government, saying that the regulations went too far, that the reporting burden on the companies was too difficult. So that lawsuit took time to kind of process, and eventually the court ruled in favor of the oil companies and said to the US government, you have to go back to the drawing board and come up with some new regulations that are less onerous and less difficult for the companies. And so the US government went back to the drawing board, came up with new regulations, and those regulations only ended up coming out about less than 6 months ago. And so the situation we have is that there was a law passed in 2010 requiring these disclosures, but no disclosures have actually happened yet. And when the new regulations came out, 6 months ago, it actually gave companies another year or so to, prepare their reporting systems. And so the numbers wouldn't have even started coming out until 2018. In the meantime, the European Union and Canada have passed similar laws, and the reporting is already starting in those countries. So UK-listed companies are already producing this information, and Canadian companies are starting to as well, and the same is true for other countries in the European Union. So the US went from being the leader in first passing this law to being quite far behind because they hadn't implemented it. So then over the last couple weeks, the Trump administration repealed Section 1504. And the reason they were able to do so that quickly was there's some obscure rule that a new president is allowed to repeal any regulations that came into place in the last 6 months of his predecessor's term in office. All the delays that I mentioned, Section 1504 fell into that category. So there was, a couple weeks ago, a resolution was brought to the US Congress to repeal this rule. It was debated with a lot of statements, by different members of Congress, also in the media and elsewhere. And it was voted, along political party lines to repeal this rule. It's seen as something that, the oil companies in the US have wanted it to be repealed, since it existed. So it's definitely seen as a victory for them. And yeah, an unfortunate setback for the kind of transparency work that we do now. Especially because looking in the UK and elsewhere, the reporting is happening. The companies, even huge ones like Shell and BP, are reporting on these payments now and don't seem to be suffering any, really challenging consequences. So yeah, definitely a setback for those of us who do transparency promotion, but hopefully not a permanent one. So kind of a long answer, but wanted to kind of provide an update on the latest about those important US provisions, because there has been some change quite recently. Okay, so moving on. Next question is about tax havens. And the question is, how can companies be transparent if you have a bunch of tax havens around the world? And this is a great question. And I think, the answer is in the question in a way, that if what you have right now is kind of a very diverse rules when it comes to corporate reporting, corporate transparency, taxation rates, that kind of thing. And so there's some jurisdictions that, because they allow more secrecy, because they have lower tax rates, become quite attractive for companies to set up businesses in. And so what you see are, international oil companies, for example, they might be headquartered in the US or the UK or France, but they have dozens and dozens of subsidiaries in the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands or in Jersey, or these jurisdictions that are known for having very kind of lenient rules. And that's for several reasons. It's for tax reasons, to try to lower their overall tax payments globally. But for some companies, it is also because, it allows them to be more secretive. And in a lot of the kind of corruption cases that have cropped up in the last few years around the oil and mining sector, you have a tendency to see the schemes using these tax havens, and in particular, setting up layers of shell companies to help hide who's involved, where the money's going, that kind of thing. So, for example, there's a Nigerian businessman who is considered to, has been charged by the Nigerian government with corruption in kind of 2013, 2014, during those years, of big oil boom years. He and a number of others were involved in a number of corrupt deals that were wildly lucrative. And so someone like that has to then move the money. And the big Panama Papers leak shows us how he did that. So this guy was a client of Mossack Fonseca, the law firm whose documents were leaked through the Panama Papers. And Mossack Fonseca is a law firm in Panama. This guy calls them up and says, I need to move some money. And so what they do is they set up for him several shell companies in the British Virgin Islands and in the Seychelles. And then those shell companies, or often layers of shell companies, bought assets. So bought a yacht, bought a lot of real estate, him to kind of launder those funds, get the money out of Nigeria, and kind of stash it away in safer and more stable assets. So these kinds of, lenient laws, secrecy, etc., makes it much easier for actors to engage in this kind of corruption. They can secretly buy apartments in London and New York and wherever else. And it makes it much, much more difficult for law enforcement, journalists, civil society activists to figure out what happened and to kind of see who owns this building next door to me, or where did all that money go out of our national oil company. So this is, I think, an absolutely crucial issue going forward, is to have some basic corporate governance and transparency requirements that are observed across jurisdictions. Because as soon as you have a jurisdiction that, doesn't require those things, then all the dirty business, will be attracted there. I mentioned kind of the British Virgin Islands and the Seychelles, other places like that, but the US has very lenient rules on these things. It is considered one of the biggest kind of secrecy jurisdictions, especially certain states where you can set up a business with almost like no identification. Switzerland is still a problem in this area, Singapore. So it's really a wide range of countries where more reporting, more kind of identity checks, and more information sharing across countries are needed. If anyone wants more information on this, the Tax Justice Network is a great organization. They work on this specifically. They put out a secrecy index that kind of ranks countries according to how well they do in this area. So that's a good resource if you want to learn more. Okay, so the next set of questions are much kind of bigger picture. And so I'll start with a caveat that, I don't think anyone can answer these questions, but they're really fascinating topics for discussion. So the first one is, why can't oil-rich countries restructure and operate a more decentralized system of government? Why is that difficult? And I think this question is coming from a trend that we've observed and that I talked about in my lecture, and that's that power in oil-rich countries tends to be highly centralized, often with just a few individuals at the top of the central government. And this is a problem because those actors, because there's so much oil wealth and so much influence, if you sit atop, an oil sector, you then kind of end up with tendencies towards dictatorship and authoritarianism. Very few kind of differing views end up in that decision-making group. And that's what leads to a lot of the political challenges that we see in many oil-rich countries. So that's kind of the trend that's out there. And the question is about, well, why can't we find ways to decentralize that authority, which I think would be desirable in some cases. There's a few practical reasons why that's difficult. One is that, running an oil sector does require certain levels of expertise. You have to collect highly sophisticated geological data just to even know where the oil is, or how much oil do we think there is, like basic information that governments gather before they start giving out exploration licenses. And then there's the work that needs to be done to regulate the oil companies, check whether they're using the right equipment, that kind of thing, collect taxes from these highly sophisticated business operations. So there's a number of tasks that go into oil sector governance that require very high and very specific levels of expertise. And if you were to decentralize those functions, in most countries, that would be very challenging. Finding that expertise at the national level is hard enough, much less across multiple regions. Another challenge, practical one, is legal, and is that most constitutions or natural resource laws the authority to manage natural resources with the central government quite clearly. So that's kind of how the systems are, a typical legal system is set up, and a country would really have to kind of break the norm for that not to be true. Another reason is political, that for those at the center, why would you want to hand over the reins to the most lucrative part of the economy to potential rivals or to other actors that you don't have total control over? Elections and transfers of power in oil-rich countries tend to be kind of winner-takes-all events. And so that kind of power sharing would be very unattractive to someone who has found their way to the top of the political system. So those are some of the reasons why it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And a few countries, demonstrate that. There are a few countries where subnational governments do play a role in running the sector. In Indonesia, regional governments can allocate mining licenses. They have that power and play that kind of a role. Does it go really well all the time? No. A lot of the governance challenges that you see at the national level are replicated at the subnational level, but it is an example of a country that's very large, federalized, quite a decentralized country, where some of those sector management responsibilities have been spread out to the regions. Another interesting example is Iraq, where you have the Kurdish regional government, which is semi-autonomous, assuming control over its own oil industry. Not always with Baghdad, the central government's permission. They've started running oil licensing rounds. The regional government is signing huge deals with international oil companies, both to produce the oil, but then also to sell it. And so you see in this case, a semi-autonomous regional government basically running its own oil sector, but still maintaining some ties with the central government. There's still money going back and forth. There's still some shared infrastructure. So that's quite interesting. And one of the really tricky elements is that in some cases, that Kurdish regional government has asserted that power. It wasn't necessarily granted by the central government. There are many more examples of countries where the resource revenues are decentralized. So with the Iraq and the Indonesia example, that's more about running the sector itself, running the mining sector, running the oil sector. That's a bit less common, but not unheard of. What's much more common is, okay, once the oil revenues come into the system, then they're shared out across different regional governments. There is some decentralization there. We see that in countries like Nigeria, DRC, Myanmar, Ghana, where a portion of the revenues will be kept by the central government and a portion will go to the regional governments. Sometimes a larger portion will go to the region where the resource came from. We certainly see that in Nigeria. And I think this can be a way to decentralize influence and power so that the subnational governments get to decide how that money gets spent. So you have some influence and wealth that's outside the central government. I think what's crucial in these kinds of systems is that the rules that govern the allocations need to be clear, established in law, and highly transparent. So what formula is used should be established and consistent. It shouldn't be up to the president on a given month to decide kind of who gets what. There needs to be a lot of kind of rule-based procedures and a lot of transparency to make sure that those allocations don't become politicized. And then at the subnational level, you can face a lot of the same challenges at the national level. Like, does the government have the capacity to spend the money well? Are they planning for the long-term development of the region, or are they just thinking about kind of short-term gains? So certainly not without its complications and challenges, but that is one way that kind of power and wealth can be decentralized in resource-rich countries. Next one. Yeah, so the question says, this week has shown how most governments, especially in Africa, fail to maximize resource wealth or maximize the returns on resource wealth. What can we do to produce more planners? So, I mean, that's interesting and a fundamental challenge. I think the simple answer I would give is that you need political will more than you need planners. So if a government decides, for political reasons that it really does want to maximize the benefits from its resource wealth, it can find planners, even if it has to go abroad, or, I mean, there's often plenty of capacity within the country. You know, if that's what the government really wants to do, they can find that capacity to do the kind of planning that's needed to make sure that resources generate development outcomes. Angola is an interesting example of this, that after, you know, a decades-long civil war, the government decided, look, we want to grow our oil sector, and, you know, over the long term. And what they did was they brought in a bunch of foreign experts. They intensively trained a number of Angolans. And now, you know, we're able to kind of build an oil sector that was successful, relatively efficient, and was able to kind of maximize the revenues from the country's oil wealth, because the government was motivated. And this is a country that after the Civil War had like extremely weak, low levels of domestic capacity and expertise. So I would say it's more about political will than it is about planning expertise. So then how do you get the political will to kind of do the planning that's needed? Some people say that horizons is a challenge, that in countries where power changes frequently, governments don't want to engage in long-term planning because they're mostly worried about, you know, delivering visible gains in a 2-3 year period so that they can win re-election or their party can win re-election. And you know, that makes sense, absolutely. But the flip side is that we don't really see resources being used well in the countries where leaders stay in power for decades and decades either. So it's certainly not, I think the ideal is that the government has to be kind of evaluated by the citizens in whether it's doing a good job in governing the sector and delivering, you know, development gains out of the resource sector. And elections are one of the only ways that citizens have to evaluate their governments. And so what we'd want to see in a lot of cases is for the government to set out a plan for how it's going to utilize resource revenues, and then for there to be enough transparency for citizens and journalists and others to monitor whether they are executing that plan successfully. And then that information can feed into an election process. And you'd see governments getting elected who were effectively implementing good plans, and those who weren't would kind of you know, not be in power anymore. But you know, getting to that point is enormously complicated, and I think we all have seen that in a number of countries. So the last question is, you know, that there's a lot of resource-rich countries that are governed by dictatorships. The question talks about how, you know, there's no significant political parties that play the democratic game. There's no separation of powers. Power is concentrated with one person. And the person says, the problem is that if you don't have institutions to control power, the situation will tend to perpetuate. And so the question is, you know, how do you change that situation? You know, what are the steps to follow to disrupt that kind of status quo of dictatorship? And the person goes on to point out that, like, in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, you have Western countries often supporting those dictatorships by providing weapons and military technology and through other means. So, I mean, you've absolutely pointed out an enormous challenge that I certainly don't have the answer to. There's a few different channels for trying to, you know, change the status quo. And we've seen this in different oil-rich countries. One is reformers, whether they're in government or in civil society or in business, can push for change within the system. This kind of change will be kind of baby steps, little by little. In some countries, getting there be elections at the local level, even if they're impossible at the national level, or slowly providing more protections for journalists and activists who, want to speak out, civic education levels, greater openness, slowly getting a government to disclose more information about how it does business. These kinds of changes can happen slowly over time and might be politically acceptable to the dictator in power. So insiders, those within the country, often can push for those kinds of incremental changes without facing enormous risks. Some actors outside of the country can take a more kind of aggressive and critical stance, really calling out the government, embarrassing them with corruption scandals that they've been able to uncover. Often these are foreign civil society actors who can do these kinds of things safely, like if an NGO in London discloses some embarrassing story about the president of some country in Central Africa, the people who work at that NGO don't have to worry about their family's safety. They have that kind of protection. So there can be this kind of inside-outside game where reformers on the inside take a quieter, kind of more gradual approach, but then voices from the outside are, really strongly criticizing the status quo. Another channel is international pressure. So pressure from influential foreign governments, international institutions like the UN or the World Bank or the IMF. All of those actors can choose to criticize a dictatorship and pressure that government to democratize. The problem is that there are a number of reasons why those actors don't do that. And the person who asked the question, raised the example of Saudi Arabia, and it's a very kind of clear example, is that when the US is building its policy towards Saudi Arabia, the issue of democratization is only one of several issues. There's security concerns, in the Middle East. There are a number of other foreign policy concerns. There's energy security concerns around, the Saudi role in dominating global oil markets. So there's all these other agendas at play that mean when the US government sits down with the Saudi government, I haven't been in the room, but I assume that criticizing their dictatorship is not number one on the agenda. Like, we know that's kind of the case. And so the problem then becomes that, especially for oil-rich dictators, they're kind of immune from pressure. They have access to money, they have influence within the global system, and so they're able to kind of withstand pressure, both externally and internally. So that's not the most kind of upbeat, optimistic answer, but I think that, you really honed in on one of the thorniest challenges is, how do you, when you have a political system that's funded by oil, but that's based on a dictatorship, unlocking pathways to change becomes very challenging. So that's not the cheeriest note to sign off on, but thanks a lot for listening, and thank you for your questions, and I really hope that you enjoy the rest of the course. Have a good day. Bye.